Now for today's program. Jonathan Greenblatt is CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, leading all aspects of the world's leading anti-hate organization. During his tenure, ADL has rebooted its Center on Extremism, launched Never Is Now, the largest annual convening in the world focused on anti-Semitism and hate, and created the Center for Technology and Society to fight the rising tide of online hate and harassment, among many other initiatives. Jonathan has been named among the top 50 most influential leaders in the global Jewish community by the Jerusalem Post and has been named by the nonprofit Times to its list of top 50 nonprofit leaders. Before joining the ADL, Jonathan served in the White House as Special Assistant to President Barack Obama and Director of the Office of Social Innovation. Jonathan is the author of the recently released book, It Could Happen Here: Why America is Tipping from Hate to the Unthinkable and How We Can Stop It, a book that sounds an alarm, warning that hate and systemic violence is gathering momentum in the United States, and that violence on a more catastrophic scale could just be around the corner. Joining Jonathan today is Robert Siegel. Robert was the senior host of NPR's award-winning evening news magazine, All Things Considered, for 30 years. In 2018, he was awarded the Edward Murrow Lifetime Achievement Award in Journalism. He has been honored with 3 silver batons from Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University, as well as the American Bar Association's Silver Gavel Award. Currently, he hosts Navigating the New Abnormal, a series of web seminars sponsored by American Friends of Rabin Medical Center on the JBS, Jewish Broadcasting Service television network. Robert is a special literary contributor to Moment magazine and serves on the advisory board for Moment's Daniel Pearl Investigative Journalism Initiative. Please welcome Jonathan Greenblatt and Robert Siegel.
Jonathan, it's good to see you.
It is always good to see you and hear you.
I'd like you to talk a little bit about the unusual beginnings of the Anti-Defamation League. It was started in response to an anti-Semitic outrage, but although a Jewish organization, its mission from the start was not limited to fighting anti-Semitism. It was broader than that.
Yes, thank you for the question, Robert. And I think it's a terrific way to kind of contextualize today's discussion and the issues we're facing. The Anti-Defamation League is the oldest anti-hate organization in America. It was founded in as you said, in response to an anti-Semitic outrage, the lynching of Leo Frank. For those who might not remember, Leo Frank was a Jewish man from New York who went down to the Atlanta area to manage a family business. It was a pencil manufacturing plant facility. And a young non-Jewish girl was found sexually assaulted and strangled to death in the property. And they immediately blamed Leo Frank. Now, Frank didn't do it. He wasn't at the place where it happened. There was exculpatory evidence. Nonetheless, Leo Frank was falsely or wrongly accused. He was then falsely convicted in a bit of a sham trial in an environment of extraordinary anti-Semitism and sort of a sensationalist fury. And the governor intervened to commute his sentence from the death penalty to life imprisonment. And the mob was so enraged by that act of leniency that they tore Leo Frank from a jail cell and they hung him from a tree. They hung him from a tree, and while his body still, swung from the rope, the town gathered round and they held a picnic, beneath the corpse. They took photographs of the body and the kind of picnic, and they turned those photographs into postcards that were distributed as souvenirs. They're still available in some places in the South. So all of this happened at a moment when Jews in this country, in the United States, were in a very different position than where we are today. They were routinely discriminated against. They couldn't buy homes in many areas. They were legally prohibited from doing so. They couldn't work in many professions. Quotas kept them out of universities or, dramatically limited their ability to get higher education. The reason why we have so many hospitals in the United States named, Beth Israel or other names that evoke sort of the Old Testament is because Jews couldn't get medical treatment, or Jewish doctors couldn't work at mainstream healthcare institutions, so the Jews founded their own hospitals. So in this environment, Leo Frank's death was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. And a group of lawyers in Chicago got together and said, we need to start an organization to fight anti-Semitism. And this just a few years after the Dreyfus trial, they wanted to make sure that something like that wouldn't happen here in the United States. So they created the ADL. And they wrote a charter for this new organization, like, Robert, you could think of it like a manifesto. And this long document, the words that they wrote, we still use today, we haven't changed them. They haven't changed in 110 years. They wrote that the purpose of this organization would be to, quote, stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure justice and fair treatment to all. So what's so interesting about that mandate, about that claim, is that 110 years ago, it made sense after the lynching of Leo Frank to create something to fight anti-Semitism. Nothing like that existed at the time.
Mm-hmm.
To then say, we will also work to secure justice and fair treatment to all, that invocation, I mean, in a world of social justice, in a world of intersectionality, in a world in which we all come to believe that all these different struggles are related, it may seem passé. But 110 years ago, when the Jews didn't have much political influence, many significant economic resources, any kind of cultural capital or social standing, to say we will fight for ourselves and we will fight for others, that this weak and vulnerable community saw its fate interlocked with the fate of others. That was a bold and outrageous idea itself. And yet that aspiration, I would say, is kind of a very Jewish one. It clearly evokes Hillel's adage about, if I'm not for myself, who will be? But if I'm only for myself, what am I? And it literally has been the animating spark in this organization for well over a century. I mean, ADL fought, my predecessors marched with Dr. King. We fought for civil rights in the 1940s, long before it was fashionable. We fought for immigration reform in the 1950s and the 1960s, again, long before it was in vogue. ADL fought for the LGBTQ community, far ahead of the gains we have today. I mean, the people, I stand on the shoulders as the head of the ADL, I stand on the shoulders of giants who realized that for the Jewish people, we could not be safe unless everyone was safe. That we couldn't be free unless everyone was free. And that remains our modus operandi today.
The title of your book, or at least the first part of the title, It Could Happen Here, is an allusion to Sinclair Lewis's 1935 novel, It Can't Happen Here. And the title in that case mocked the smug confidence of Americans who had seen Mussolini and Hitler come to power in Europe and who assumed it can't happen here. It did happen here in the novel. A demagogue takes over the US government.
Yep.
Does your use of it could happen here mean that you think an American fascist style government takeover is possible in the United States?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. You're right. It's an allusion to Sinclair Lewis. And I think that way you described it, it was a rebuttal, if you will, of the smug kind of arrogance of some in our country. It turns out that I will tell you up front, Robert, I believe in American exceptionalism. This has been the most extraordinary, resilient democracy in the history, I think, of certainly of humanity. We've never seen a country like this that was founded on this idea of democracy, of e pluribus unum. And while America is far from perfect, it is the quest to be a more perfect union, which has been it's the genius of our constitutional system. And yet, while I believe in it, it turns out that we are not unique in all the ways that we thought. And so I wrote this book, started working on it well before January 6th, 2021, well before we understood the depths of President Trump's depravity and his authoritarianism. But unfortunately, I think that confirms my thesis. The reality is I'm the grandson of a Holocaust survivor from Germany, Robert, right? Mm-hmm. And my grandfather, he wouldn't talk about what he went through much, but I once did an interview with him, like I was a high school student, it was a project. And I asked him in that interview, and he saw the worst, I mean, beyond the worst of humanity. And I said, you know, Poppy, when you were a young man, did you ever imagine that your grandchildren, like me and my brother and my cousins, would all be born in America? And my grandfather, in his thick German accent, said, "Ach, no, never thought about this when I was a young man." He said, "But if I thought I would have grandchildren, I would have thought they'd be born in Germany, because where else would we be?" I mean, my grandfather, when he was a young man, never could have imagined that one day the only country he ever knew, my grandfather fought the First World War for Germany, great-grandfather, never could have imagined that one day the country would turn on him, destroy everything he ever loved, you know, literally just slaughter almost his entire family and force him to flee here as a refugee. So he never thought it could happen there, never.
Mm-hmm.
Flash forward for me, maybe 10, 12 years later, I'm in the living room of my in-laws in Los Angeles. Now, they are Iranian Americans. They are Jews from Iran who say their lineage goes back to the Babylonian exile. And Iran was the only place they ever knew until the rise of, you know, Khomeini and kind of the fascism of the Islamic Republic forced them to flee, destroyed everything they ever loved. You know, meant they had to abandon their homeland and come here to the United States as refugees, which they did in 1988. And I was with my father-in-law with my first child, and he was crawling on the floor. And I said, "Mansur Khan," that's what I call him, "Mansur Khan, can you believe you have an American grandson?" And he came here, my father-in-law, maybe he's 50, like 49, 50. And Mansur Khan says, imagine, he's a very thick Persian accent, which I also won't try to do. He said, "If I ever thought I would have grandchildren, I thought they'd be in Iran." And then he said, Robert, he said, "Because where else would we be?" He literally used the same words that my grandfather had used. And so, like, my father-in-law never could have guessed that kind of authoritarianism and fascism would come to Iran and come for the Jews. Like, my grandfather never could have guessed that authoritarianism and fascism would come to Germany and come for the Jews. I don't think I can afford the luxury of thinking that it can't happen here. And what we've seen in the last few years, the rise of a kind of anti-intellectualism, the rise of a kind of authoritarianism, I think reminds us that it could happen here. And it might look different.
Yep.
But it could very well happen here.
Let me read something that you write in the book. You write this: "During the 1930s and 1940s, anti-Semitism was rampant in the United States, with about 40% of the US population subscribing to hateful beliefs, according to one survey.
Yep.
In 1964, ADL research found 29% held strong anti-Semitic beliefs, defined as subscribing to 6 or more common stereotypes about Jews out of a total of 11 such stereotypes. As of 2020, you write, only 11% of the US population, this is, was anti-Semitic by this definition. How do you understand or reconcile a steady decline in anti-Semitic attitudes among the American population at large with an increase in recent years in anti-Semitic incidents and attacks?
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary. And it demonstrates the kind of contradiction, if you will, of the moment that we're in. So as you said, the numbers have decreased dramatically in terms of attitudes. I think Jews today have been able to succeed in almost every sphere. The laws limiting our ability to buy those homes or to attend those, the practice to attend those universities or work in those professions, they're all gone. And Jews are more accepted today, perhaps in America, than in any other country in the world. I mean, this has been an amazing, amazing society for our people. And at the same time, what is also inarguable, indisputable, is while attitudes have gone down, incidents have gone up. I mean, literally in 2021, Robert, we had the highest number of anti-Semitic incidents the ADL has ever seen in more than 40 years of collecting this data. Nearly triple the number in 2021 that we had in 2015.
And there are no differences in reporting standards there. I mean, the same types of incidents were reported in the past that were reported.
Yeah, we look at harassment, vandalism, violence, and just to put a further point on that, Robert, my staff, I have about 400 full-time employees, and I have most of them are in the field. We have 25 offices. We investigate every incident we report.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody calls and we check in with local law enforcement or the victim or the community. Just because we hear about something doesn't mean we include it. Frankly, in 2021, we investigated a reported 9,600 plus incidents that came to us. And we only tabulated 2,717 of them as anti-Semitic. So I think we're pretty discriminating in this regards. That being said, the fact that incidents have gone up while attitudes have gone down tells us a few things. Number one, we have seen the normalization of anti-Semitism right now. People don't even realize kind of what they're doing, but these tropes about George Soros or Sheldon Adelson, or these tropes about Zionists occupying government or manipulating the government or whatnot. These have become far more prevalent than we've ever seen. I mean, you can turn on Tucker Carlson any night and hear about the Great Replacement Theory, which is literally torn from the pages of white supremacist propaganda. That's number one. Number two, extremists feel very emboldened in this environment. And while some might not understand what they're doing, the extremists on the far right and the kind of radical left, they do understand it, Robert, and they employ the myths with intention and with impact to intimidate and terrorize Jewish people. That's the second thing. And the third thing, Robert, is social media. Social media is a super spreader of this, and it creates the conditions where copycat type acts happen with tremendous frequency.
One thing that comes through time and again in your book is that you view succumbing to hateful views as not necessarily a terminal condition. Some racists or anti-Semites may remain lifelong captives of their hatreds, but there are also people who express such hateful ideas. But when you talk to them, when you approach them, when you talk seriously with them, they change. My favorite is actually a professor at Duke whom you write about, a Turkish-born man named Abdullah Antepli. But there are several such. Can you talk a little bit about him?
Imam Abdullah Antepli is an extraordinary individual. Born and raised and educated in Turkey, he was at a young age kind of radicalized by the dominant media that was there, that was highly anti-Semitic, very anti-Zionist. And, let's be honest, I mean, there's the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, Turkey's a very secular country historically, but, Erdogan and the AKP are a Muslim Brotherhood party, and it's become more and more sort of radical in some ways that are very different than some of its Western traditions. So Abdullah was raised in this environment, imbibed this, and believed all of it. By any definition, we would consider him sort of like Islamic fundamentalist or extremist by any standard definition. And yet then he got older and started doing his own research and came to understand that many of the myths about Jews or Jewish control or Zionist domination were flat out untrue and were little more than propaganda. Not only that, he then began to get involved in interfaith efforts, bringing together Jewish and Muslim communities. Actually started a program at the Shalom Hartman Institute, a think tank with offices in Jerusalem and in New York, that actually brought together young Muslims to learn about the Jewish people, about Israel, and about Zionism. And today, Abdullah Antepli is now not only the head, he's an imam and a professor at Duke University. He's a revered person nationally in terms of interfaith and interreligious dialogue. And his journey from being a would-be member of the Muslim Brotherhood to today promoting the brotherhood of people from all faiths is an extraordinary one. He's someone who's, I just admire his, and by the way, I should say, Robert, he is a man of faith.
Yeah.
Like, he is a devout Muslim. He prays 5 times a day. He lives his life according to Quranic principles, and he embraces and loves his Jewish brothers and sisters. And for that, I deeply admire him.
Jonathan, I have a couple of questions for you, too, that I could chicken out and say I'll play devil's advocate, but they're actually concerns that I have, so
It's okay.
They're my own. The first one involves something that occurs in a device you describe and you represent called the pyramid of hate, which is an interesting graphic showing how there's a kind of an escalation of hatred that can take place. The broadest base of the pyramid you describe as people with biased attitudes, but that would lead, as you go up the pyramid, to acts of bias, and then to systemic discrimination, and then still higher to bias-motivated violence, and ultimately the unfortunate pinnacle of this pyramid of hate is genocide. And it's under acts of bias that I want to ask you something about there, where you include non-inclusive language, insensitive remarks, microaggressions. We all know there are some words that are out of bounds. I wouldn't use them here or anywhere else. But non-inclusive, insensitive language and microaggressions strike me as very rapidly moving targets. It is now deemed non-inclusive by many activists, academics, and some big news organizations to speak of pregnant women in your stories about the Supreme Court, because the phrase is uninclusive of people whose gender is fluid. And so unlike pregnant persons or pregnant people. I once recently my wife and I were walking our very cute dog in the park, and a very well-spoken teenage girl with her mother came by, and she saw how cute the dog was and asked, may I pet them? Because she had learned not to with people, and applied it to dogs, that you don't presume gender of people. They may be whatever. And I just wonder, I know I don't mean to trivialize this, but I fear that including such things, seeing such things as moments of hatred, risk taking normal speech that hasn't been deconstructed and reconstructed by the sociology department, and making people who use it, ordinary people who use it, feel like they're being accused of being hateful when they're just speaking the way people have spoken for centuries.
Look, it's a very fair point.
Okay.
So I don't think there are pregnant persons. There are pregnant women. Yeah. Period. Like and I appreciate what you're saying. And we need to recognize that many of the things that we talk about in terms of bias or prejudice, are something like social constructs, like race, for example. Race isn't real. Like, there's one human race, and Jewish people or Black people or Latino people, like, we are all humans, and race is a social construct. So that changes over time. I mean, you may remember, you may have seen this exchange I had with Whoopi Goldberg back in January, where she said the Nazis wouldn't have come for her.
Yeah.
Or the Nazis would have come for her, but not for the Jews. The Jews aren't a race. The Holocaust wasn't about race. Of course, the Holocaust was all about race.
Yes,
literally, yes. The Germans thought they were the master race. That was the language they used. They thought the Jews were a subhuman race. That's the language they used. But it was a different notion of race than what we have today in America, where race is typically about how someone like physically presents, the color of their skin, right? So I think it is fair that these are something like moving targets. And we do need to recognize that it varies by place and time.
Yes.
And as I wrote in the book, Robert, I don't believe in cancel culture.
Yes.
I believe in counsel culture. You pull people in. You don't push them away when they make a mistake. Now, that being said, there are some words or phrases that have been used for, let's say, hundreds of years that aren't right.
Yes.
And so, again, we don't need to get into that here. I don't even want to repeat that language. But I think there's a difference between epithets that are designed to demonize or dehumanize people and pronouns.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean that I'm being transphobic or insensitive to people who are dealing with issues of gender identity, but it does mean I do think the most important thing with all this, Robert, is a degree of reasonableness.
Yes, yes.
Reasonableness.
Well, let me put my other concern to you, which is perhaps a little more controversial. My other concern is about, you address it many times in the book, of drawing a line between anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel. And I certainly know that there are criticisms of Israel that are hugely excessive, as if the West Bank is the only place where human rights are being violated on the planet. And I speak as a reporter who also went to Israel, reported quite a few times, and was, for writing things that I didn't think were such, was called anti-Israeli in some cases. So here's the question. Someone calls Zionism or Israel apartheid, and you would say, well, that's an anti-Semitic, that betrays an anti-Semitic attitude. It certainly exaggerates the situation of Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel. But on the West Bank, I mean, the Israeli government just fell apart over a law which had been expected to pass to continue to extend Israeli law, the protections of Israeli law, to West Bank settlers, while the Arabs in the village next door are covered by military law. And there are violent acts between the two. It's not all Arab on Jewish violence. There are young men who do the other. And that kind of separation, I can't bring myself to tell someone who refuses to rationalize that and who feels it's a degree of an apartness or segregation that's apartheid-like. I can't bring myself to call him anti-Semitic for that. That's the difference I would put to you.
I'm glad you raised the issue, and it is complicated in some ways and not complicated in other ways.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, Zionism is an idea. It's this notion of the Jewish people having a right to a homeland. And by the way, political Zionism, as we know it, has been around for 120 years or so, since the Basel Convention. But the reality is that Zionism is a millennial idea. Open up any Jewish prayer book, almost any Jewish prayer, for goodness sakes,
yes.
And there's references to returning to Jerusalem. So returning to Zion, I mean, it isn't new. So Zionism is this old idea that now has a bit of a political meaning today, that Jews have the right to self-determination. There is that in and of itself is an idea like lots of other ideas about self-determination. Anti-Zionism is this idea that Jews do not have the right to self-determination.
Yeah.
That in a political context today, that Jews do not have the right to a homeland in that place that we know as Israel. Now, if you believe, or if you don't believe in any notions of nationalism, Robert, if you don't believe in the idea of America, or the idea of China, you don't believe that people have the right to self-determination, then I'm okay with you being an anti-Zionist. But if you think I'm an anti-Zionist, but I believe the Palestinians should have a state, or I'm an anti-Zionist, but I think there's nothing wrong. I mean, I don't like what they're doing to the Uyghurs, but I certainly want to call for the dissolution of China. I don't like how America was founded on the slaughter of the indigenous people, but I'm pretty happy to have my rights here as an American. Like, that is different. When you just call out Jews and not anyone else, that's a kind of animus that I think is very problematic.
Yes, agreed.
No, but that is not. In fact, as a Zionist, as an unapologetic, proud Zionist, that doesn't prevent me or preclude me from criticizing policies of the state of Israel. Literally, I was just calling out this activity that happened at the Western Wall a couple days ago, where a Jewish family that wanted to observe, a conservative family that was observing their son's bar mitzvah, they were attacked and assaulted by a group of sort of radical Orthodox people. That's ugly and wrong, and the state of Israel should provide protections so anyone can practice their religion, including Jews, if you will. That doesn't make me anti-Zionist to criticize, or anti-Semitic to criticize the state of Israel. But if Israel is the only country that I think doesn't have the right to exist, the only country that I want to destroy, that's where I think we get into something different. Now, let's be fair, let's be honest, Robert. I think anti-Semitism has, in some contexts, has been overused, right? And we need to make sure that we're calling out Jew hatred for what it is when it really is. That's what I would say. The last point I'll just make that's related is, as the head of the ADL, I see stuff all the time where a BDS protest on a college campus leads to swastikas at Jewish fraternity. Or, you'll see an anti-Israel rally with signs with signs that invoke the blood libel, or say Jews have too much power, anti-Semitic kind of fictions. So anti-Zionism, the idea that only Jews don't deserve the right you want for everyone else, is a kind of anti-Semitism, if not in theory of some, almost always in practice. That doesn't mean that I expect the Palestinian living on in Area C of the West Bank to be marching the Israel Independence Day parade. But it does mean those activists who get up every morning and say, my goal is to destroy the Jewish state.
Right.
I'm sorry, that's anti-Semitism.
Well, I guess there's one other point that I wanted to ask you about that I thought was an omission. I wonder what you think about it. In trying to understand why there is a rise of hatred and why the internet is full of the kind of bias that circulates on it. So for the social media, one thing that I don't think you mention in the book is what I think is very important, that since the 1990s, national economic policies with the US and its partners in investment and trade have been terrific for well-educated people who work in the sciences, technology, and finance and tend to live on the coasts. And it's been a disaster for people who work in American manufacturing and who are would fancy the places they live in, the industrial heartland of the US. There are a lot of Americans who see themselves as losers in the past quarter century, and we are among the winners. We're seen as being, among the winners because Jews are a highly educated group and have, as a result, had a pretty good quarter of a century. Do you think that degree of inequality, which has actually increased in America over the past couple of decades, is it a contributing factor to hatred or anti-Semitism?
There is no question that economic conditions create an environment that can be very conducive to anti-Semitism. Look, anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory. It's this idea that the Jews hold power, or the Jews are trying to kill Gentile or non-Jewish people. It manifests in lots of ways, Robert. Mm-hmm. But we know conspiracy theories and the scapegoats that drive them thrive in environments where systems fail. And so whether it's markets failing or government failing, and leaders lack answers. And so it becomes very easy, whether the leader is an elected official or the leader is a member of the church, or the leader is appointed by, as a monarch appointed by God, or by the way, demagogues who have platforms, to blame someone for these conditions. And the Jews have always been an easy target. As a minority living typically in majoritarian societies that are either Christian or Muslim, the Jews lived apart. They had different dietary practices, different religious practices. They often lived in ghettos that were imposed upon them, or they chose to congregate themselves. And so, Robert, they were different. So they were easy people for the demagogue to point to and say it's their fault. So in the United States, in the last 25 years, as we've seen this, the economic circumstances shift as they have, Jews have been an easy target like they've been throughout history. Now, the reality is there are plenty of Jews in the industrial heartland, in Detroit, in Cleveland, or in the places like New Haven or Bridgeport or other spots where manufacturing left and who are struggling today. But that doesn't stop the bigots from saying, you know what? It's not the fault of our elected officials. It's not the fault that we don't have, a more of a vocational education. It's not the fault of all these markets. George Soros did this. The Jews did this. The Jews are doing this. And that is many ways. Anti-Semitism, Robert, it's been described as the oldest hatred. Mm-hmm. And I think there's some truth to it, because again and again over time, it becomes an easy option for the demagogue or the failed leader to blame someone for the circumstances.
Are you optimistic about the efforts of ADL and other groups to identify, to contain, maybe once in a while to convert advocates of hatred? Do you see some metrics, apart from the bad ones, about how many assaults there are? Do you see some indication that the efforts that are really quite interesting and quite energetic are yielding some fruit in that score?
Well, I think so. I mean, last year, there are probably two dimensions. Like, our theory of change at ADL is, in the short term, we protect, right? So we track hate crimes, we train law enforcement. We're the largest trainer of law enforcement in the country, and we investigate and we provide tips. Last year, we provided over 1,300 tips to law enforcement to avert crimes before they happened, right? To point out and identify potential threats before something terrible happens like Highland Park. So I know in the short term that the arrests and prosecutions that have happened because of our work have saved lives and prevented bad things from happening. So in the short term, I think we've had some success. In the medium term, we do advocacy. We try to change laws in the courts. We try to, or in Congress, we try to litigate in the courts and, influence the judiciary. And I know we've had success there. I think about not just like the hate crimes laws that ADL helped to pass, but trying to make this country more tolerant, more inclusive for all marginalized communities. And look, in so many ways there are challenges, but so many ways it is. I mean, this country looks a lot different than it did 100 years ago, 50 years ago, in terms of being supportive of people, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity or how they pray or where they're from. That's all pretty good. And then in the long run, we do anti-bias education. And because I think you got to change culture if you really, and in fact, to grab hearts and minds, if you really want to make change. And we last year we educated almost 4 million kids with anti-hate content in schools. So and if you talk to young people today, Robert, they are more tolerant, they are more inclusive, they are more open-minded than prior generations. So I don't think ADL is all the credit for that, by no means. But I think if you think about the people the crimes we've helped to stop and the communities we've helped to touch, the laws we've helped to change to make America more inclusive, and the attitudes we're helping to shape, I feel good about all that. Now, the challenge that we have, Robert, is I think we are in an environment where hate is definitely empirically on the rise. We're in an environment in which, again, I think authoritarians are creating the conditions in which extremists feel emboldened and things are going the wrong way. So while we've had some success, we have to redouble our efforts. We have to renew ourselves and recommit to this fight every single day if we want to win.
You write about businesses in the book and about the role that business can play. You remark on the awkward actions of Ben and Jerry's, but also many other companies which seem to be taking rather consistent and successful efforts. The great exception here being social media companies.
Mm-hmm.
How big a problem? I mean, the internet's not going to go away. I mean, we're not going to return to. I may to my dying day get a couple of newspapers on paper in the morning and all that, and once in a while receive a letter or write one. But I understand where the future lies here. So, how significant is the responsibility, in your view, of Facebook, Twitter, et cetera?
I mean, I think, one of the things that makes this moment so different and how hate has continued to flourish and extremes has continued to grow, I think is because of social media. It's a super spreader of hate. The ADL not only tracks hate offline in the real world, we track it online. We just released our latest annual report on online hate and harassment. The data is staggering. Some 40+% of internet users report being bullied or harassed online, Robert. And I think it's 28% report serial harassment. LGBTQ users and Asian American and Pacific Islanders are the most frequent targets. Jews, I think, come in third. And it's social media has created the conditions in which, and we know this, right? When we talk to someone face to face, we're reminded of that adage of doing unto others, right? We talk with a level of humanity and decency when you're face to face. But like when all we do is talk through the phone, it's broken down a lot of those barriers. And it's created that people treat each other in very inhumane, indecent sort of ways. I also think that what's really frightening is as social media has reshaped the way we shop or the way we socialize, just the way we take in information. When you read that newspaper, there's a whole set of practice, what are they called, standards and practices behind the journalists in that paper. There's an ombudsman making sure you get things right. There's a capability for retraction the next day. You screw up a story. There's none of that on Facebook, for example. In fact, their business model is based it's not fact book, right? It's Facebook. It's about how things look. And the business model is about driving clicks, not getting the news right. And so the whole thing is designed in such a manner that it is almost incompatible with a level of rationality and the level of sobriety that you get from more managed journalistic practices. So
Should
I
they
think
lose
we've
their
got a long way
immunity?
to go.
Should those companies lose their immunity to for suit for libel actions and
1,000,000% yes. Companies should be liable if they promote libel. I mean, it's kind of simple. And you when you were at NPR, you're at the newspaper or Moment Magazine. Why does Moment Magazine not have the same protections that Facebook has? Or by the contrary, why doesn't Facebook live by the same laws of gravity that every other publishing company does in the world? I mean, it's actually not that hard. We need to change that exemption if we want to get this right.
Now, many people who are watching us have submitted questions. I can see them, so I'm going to I'll do my best to manipulate my laptop gracefully and put some questions to you. And the first one I'm going to read is from Joe Nalvin, who asked this. ADL, he says, should be against all discrimination. Against all discrimination. In the Harvard discrimination case, ADL distinguished anti-Semitic discrimination from that against Asian students. However, Joe Nalvin writes, Harvard has disguised its discrimination under the pretextual factor that Asian students have a problematic personality. Would ADL reevaluate its position given the nature of Harvard discrimination?
The short answer is yes. We are looking at that case. We did file an amicus brief when that case was at a lower level. It's very divisive. You know, the reality is that there are certainly practices at these universities that exclude people on factors other than their scores, their academic performance, it would appear. On the other hand, we also think that diversity and inclusion are critical factors to think about creating a mosaic at the university. So you've got the kind of representation that ensures that kids don't just get educated in the classroom, but outside of the classroom in the richest possible way. But nonetheless, we are looking at that case literally right now. We are very concerned about the potential to be discriminating against people because of their Asian American heritage or anything else for that matter. So the short answer is yes, we are looking at that.
There's a question from an anonymous attendee. Please explain how or why Governor Glenn Youngkin of Virginia has been asked to create a commission to combat anti-Semitism. He is someone who pursues, according to the writer, a racist agenda, opposition to teaching true U.S. history, book censorship, removal of former Governor Youngkin's commission report on African American history from the internet, and removal of the work of Governor Northam's inclusive community from the internet. Clearly, Governor Youngkin and his base, this listener writes, have no interest in combating hatred of minority or marginalized groups. So please explain why the Virginia Jewish Federations should even work with him. And he clearly does not share our Jewish values. I can't say that I'm, although a Virginian, I can't say that I'm familiar with this controversy, but perhaps you are.
In truth, I'm not familiar with it. I don't know about the commission. I do know that I think governors of either party who pull books from libraries or who promote a kind of, newspeak, I find that very problematic. I don't know the specifics of this commission, and I certainly can't speak for the Virginia Federation, but I'm happy, Robert, if there's some kind of follow-up mechanism to have my office in the DC that covers, we have 25 offices around the country. I have an office that covers the DC, Virginia, Maryland area. I could have them look into it if someone wants
perhaps
to.
the anonymous attendee can send an email to them. Here's another question from Alan Mann, who writes, in the past, the ADL and the Jewish community were actively in the past involved in the civil rights movement. But as we have seen from Ferguson to George Floyd, there seems to be a lack of knowledge of this past history, and we see minority communities targeting the Jewish community. Do we need to start re-educating these communities about the mission statement of the ADL?
Well, I think it's a great question, Alan. So a few things. So number one, I am constantly educating everyone I meet about the mission statement of the ADL. Enough people in our own Jewish community don't know about the work that we do, let alone in non-Jewish communities. I think number two, look, Black-Jewish relations have been an integral part, I think, of the social fabric of this country for hundreds of years. The reality is that, like my predecessors, Ben Epstein, he marched with Dr. King in Selma, literally arm in arm for part of the march. I have a picture at my desk in New York of Ben and Dr. King standing alongside Robert Kennedy and LBJ in the Rose Garden, around the Voting Rights Act of 1964. So, or the Civil Rights Act, sorry. So the ADL has been involved with working with Black leadership, and I'm still feel blessed to work today with the National Urban League, the NAACP, Color of Change, the Legal Defense Fund, and so many other groups that represent the Black community. Now, on the other hand, the Black and Jewish communities, I'm generalizing, but don't always agree on every issue. That isn't new. That's been happening for decades and decades. So I think we need to work to find ways that we can collaborate, because ultimately, as the two communities most frequently targeted by hate, we have more in common than the things that keep us apart. So I think it's a critical part of my mission, because, to be honest, anti-Black racism isn't just the problem of my Black friends. It's my problem too as a white person. And anti-Semitism isn't just my problem as a Jewish man. It's the problem of my non-Jewish friends too. So I think we're all in this together, and we do it because you can only really have safety, Alan, through a combination of security and solidarity.
Here's a question or a comment from Janet Rice, who says, I'm cautious about the typical focus of opprobrium on social media. Often it's Jews focusing on other Jews. And she asks, isn't this like the exclusive blaming of Jews or Israel? There are people like Zuckerberg who are very prominent in social media, isn't hardly the only one, who are Jewish.
Sure.
Does that in any way change your attitude toward their behavior?
Not at all. I mean, I think that you can be a Jewish person doesn't, again, preclude you or exempt you from potentially, with intention or unintentionally, trafficking in anti-Semitic tropes. And the reality is that the fact that Mark is Jewish and there are other people in the leadership at Facebook or Meta, whatever it's called, let alone at Twitter or the company we know as Alphabet or Amazon or Zoom or any of these businesses. I mean, look, the reality is we focus on social media because extremists have exploited these platforms, and the platforms, kind of a libertarian philosophy, plus, as Robert pointed out, their lack of liability has created is kind of a perfect storm for prejudice to take hold and to spread. That's why we focus on it. And it's not about speech you don't like. Like, look, it doesn't really matter how I vote. It's about what I value. And what we're trying to do is to eliminate the ability of extremists. So I think this is just really important to point out, Robert. This is not about censorship, but it should be, look, freedom of speech is not the freedom to slander people. And freedom of expression isn't the freedom to incite violence. So what we're trying to do is to curb that, not to censor speech or anything like that.
When this conversation happens with generally the discussion of social media, I'm reminded of when I went back to read Louis Brandeis's article in which he and I think it's Warren, who was his law partner, really conceptualized the right to privacy. And what inspires them to do so is the intrusion into everyday life of a new technology, and the technology is photography. And people would now, in this new world we're in with photography, your image could be taken without your permission, and it could appear in a newspaper. And this was an invasion of privacy that in the minds of Brandeis and Warren, required our acknowledgement of a constitutional right to protect it. One thing that didn't happen was photography didn't go away. I mean, photography only got more intrusive over time. So I guess thinking ahead, I suppose you could outlaw algorithms that direct people toward like-minded sites, but we're going to have information flying at 1,000 miles a second for the rest of our lives and our kids' lives before it gets still faster than that. And it would seem to be, whatever the solution is, we have to work through, I would assume, the reality that this is media. This is
I mean, you're making such a good point. I don't know the art. I haven't read that article, and yet I think it's super germane. I mean, think about it. What would Brandeis say? A world from photographs to now Photoshop to deepfake videos that are entirely, constructed out of thin air that appear as if it's the real person saying something or doing something. So one of the, look, Robert, I think as you know about me, I come from the technology industry. I
Yes.
worked in Silicon Valley for many years. I really believe we have to engage and work with the companies if we want to win. I mean, the pace of innovation is so great. God help us if we're relying on octogenarian senators with their AOL email addresses or their Hotmail accounts to save us. I mean, from the metaverse or
Yeah.
from to help to explain blockchain, I mean, so we've got to work with the companies where we can, and where they're unwilling to do so, we've got to make sure we've got the right kind of regulatory regime. And it's got to be flexible and it's got to be smart so it adapts with the times, because as you're saying, change is happening at such a brisk rate.
I should acknowledge a comment replying to something that I said. Comment is, no, there are pregnant persons. A trans male friend who wanted to have a child is outwardly male and chose to have a baby and was thus outwardly a pregnant male. Because this is explaining why, in the view of Joan Eisenstadt, who wrote that, that she agrees with the idea that we should not be saying pregnant women, that it ignores the situation of people like her friend. Yes, go ahead.
Point taken, Joan. I hear you, and I appreciate that she shared that comment.
Elaine Yaker, well, she wrote, is there anything that can be done to affect a change in the social media platforms and reduce the harm they produce? I think you'd say make them responsible for what they carry as one.
Just make them responsible. And Robert, you said something just a second ago, you can't outlaw algorithms.
Yeah.
You can't outlaw algorithms, but algorithms aren't individuals. So we may have freedom of speech for a person. I can say what I want, but that doesn't mean that the company should be able to algorithmically amplify it for the world to see. You know what? Look, Robert, your editors, when you were on All Things Considered, when you were hosting the program, you made a choice about the people you chose to interview.
Yes.
And so we would just say, so that the editorial control gave people a voice, or didn't, if you will. You chose not to have, let's say, I don't know, David Duke on your show for a weekly commentary. That wasn't censorship. You were making a choice. So I think Facebook and these other companies, when they choose to algorithmically amplify David Duke, they're making a choice. We should hold them accountable for that. Simple.
Jennifer Badani asks, what about taking out a full-page ad in the newspaper exposing truth, taking on one hater at one time?
Jennifer, I think it's not a bad idea. It's expensive. Take out ads in the newspaper, and I think we can't play a linear game. It can't be one-to-one. We got to play a many-to-many game. So, look, we've worked with the media companies, and we'll continue to do so. But I think we've got to come up with the right models that can scale to the size of the problem. So ads at one at a time, that kind of linear approach, I wouldn't try that. Something that has a more, logarithmic capability, like software, is the way that I would try to take this.
A couple of people asked the question of whether what happened at Highland Park would strike you as a hate crime. And I would ask more broadly about the significance of hate crimes. Even if that wasn't a hate crime, it's mass murder. And mass murder carries a pretty heavy penalty in the United States.
Oh, totally.
How significant is it that we should determine if that was an act of bias or not?
Well, super quick, right? All of our hearts break for the people who were affected by the shooting at Highland Park. The head of my Chicago office was there at the parade with his 3 young children when it happened, literally. An ADL, one of my board members, her uncle, is among the 6 people who were killed. A former ADL trainer was among the 15 plus people who were wounded. This is a crime that particularly affected my community and my organization in some pretty direct ways. That being said, based on the analysis of, at ADL, we track the bad guys, as I said, and, we got called by the FBI. I mean, we were there at the incident, but they called us to help do some investigation of the shooter. And as we did after Buffalo, as we did after Charleston, as we did after, all these other hate crimes, Poway, Pittsburgh, El Paso, you name it, we were unable to identify that this shooter, although clearly deranged, was motivated by bias or bigotry against the Jewish people or other people. We've since discovered some things he said online that were racist and anti-Semitic, but it does not appear that this crime was perpetrated with the intent to harm people because of an immutable characteristic like race or faith or gender, etc. So a hate crime is different than an ordinary crime. And when the act is committed because of, again, someone's attributes, it has an impact beyond the individual. It often terrorizes a whole community. It intimidates and marginalizes them. That's why we press for hate crimes laws that ensure there are extra penalties. Now, Robert, I think it's also worth noting, and I think it's in the book, I think we should look at interesting new models for justice, like restorative justice, forcing white supremacists to work with Jewish communities after the crime, or Black communities, so they see and they learn the humanity of the people they were dehumanizing. Like, I don't think we should just, lock them up and throw away the key. But it's really important that we recognize that the hate crime has a greater impact than the actual offense itself and the person or institution that was harmed. That's why we think they're very important.
I understand that when the offense might be seen as relatively minor otherwise, that is, if it's a difference between calling a swastika that's painted on a synagogue, malicious mischief, or adding something more potent to that by noting that it's a hate crime. But I must say, whenever we say was the mass murder a hate crime or not, it seems to be mass murder is a pretty hateful crime, whatever it's done.
That's fair. I mean, these are hateful crimes. These are harmful crimes. These are horrible crimes. We just think, like, for example, Robert, when a gay couple is attacked in broad daylight by someone who says, "I'm going to kill you blanks," right? And I don't believe in blanks. So that's just different than an average assault. The pain felt by the victims who were hit over the head with a pipe might not be different, but the intent of intimidating the gay community is different. But I'm not going to be one who's going to minimize the horror of gun violence. I'm not going to be someone who's going to sit here today and say, "Oh yeah, this is worse than that," in as much as the pain felt by the people who were massacred at Highland Park or Las Vegas or any one of the hundreds of mass casualty incidents that happen every year in this country. All of them deserve to be called out, and all of them, we can only have sympathy for the victims and demand change in the laws to make this less likely to happen.
Well, Jonathan Greenblatt, CEO of the Anti-Defamation League. Is it still formally the Anti-Defamation League, or is it formally ADL?
Well, it's formally the Anti-Defamation League, but we call it ADL because it's easier to say,
yeah,
and maybe a bit more easier to spell.
Well, thank you it's been fascinating. It was fascinating reading your book, It Could Happen Here, and it's great talking with you about it.
I am not going to lie for all 159 people on Moment magazine to hear. Like, it is such an honor for me to know that Robert Siegel read my book and found even the slightest bit interesting. No. Is super exciting and gratifying to me, Robert. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Jonathan. Great talking with you.
Thank you both for this very important conversation. Jonathan, before we go, I do want to ask one more question for the folks who are sitting home wondering what they can do. Aside from, being in touch with ADL, what are things that people can do to help combat hate and anti-Semitism?
It's a great question. So I think there are a few things you can do. Number one, I think it's really important that people speak out when hate happens. So when you hear an act of anti-Semitism, whether it's in your Facebook feed or at the water cooler at work or at the kiddish table at Shoal, like, people need to speak up. That's number one. And by the way, speak out not just when anti-Semitism, but when other kinds of hate happen. Anti-Semitism, Deborah Lipstadt, our new special envoy and the Holocaust scholar, she's written that anti-Semitism starts with the Jews, it never ends with the Jews. And that's true. Unfortunately, it's just the reality that it creates an environment in which prejudice is more likely to happen, stereotyping and scapegoating more likely to happen. So call hate when it happens, it's directed at you or somebody else. That's number one. Number two, I think you've got to share facts. Please don't forward the lunatic email from your neighbor's uncle's brother-in-law telling you that he's sure that the earth is flat and that, George Soros paid for whatever. Look, we need to dial down the drama, if you will, focus really on facts, like get the information and treat people, like I was telling Robert earlier, the way you want to be treated, right? Like, treat people in the humane way that you want them to treat you. I think that's important. And again, counsel culture, not cancel culture. So embrace people when they make a mistake and explain why that is. Don't eject or excommunicate them. So number one, speak out is a way we can fight hate. Number two, share fact, we can fight it. Number three, you got to show strength. You got to lean in. This democracy itself, and let alone this kind of work, this isn't a spectator sport like the old lotto commercial. You got to be in it to win it. So whether you want to volunteer with any, there are lots of great organizations fighting hate, including ADL, but there are also others. Volunteer, vote, get involved. Like there's so many ways. Like bring an anti-bias program to your school district when a hazing incident or hate incident has happened. Don't show up at the school board and scream at the members. If you're upset about something, start a petition. Like there are ways. Again, we can share facts. We can speak up, but we can do it in a way that's respectful, that's constructive, and that actually makes a difference.
Great.
Lastly, if you want to learn more, I would be remiss if I didn't say go to adl.org, or there's this great book you can buy on Amazon that I would encourage you to check out. Robert apparently thought it was okay.
Yes. Again, thank you both. We really appreciate it. The title of the book is It Could Happen Here. I will be sending out a link, an email later next week that will have a link to the recording as well as a link to Jonathan's book. I also wanted to let people know that Moment Magazine has embarked on a year-long program called Wide River Project. We're doing this in partnership with the Western State Center, where we're taking a deep dive into the relationship between the Jewish and Black communities. And so I will include, I will include information about that. We have a whole series of Zoominars that we have already done. We have more to come. So for people who are interested, you'll get more information about that.
If memory serves me, wasn't Moment Magazine started by Elie Wiesel?
It was 1975.
I mean, what a privilege it is to have had the opportunity to be a part of this today, Suzanne. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. And again, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Robert. Go to momentmag.com where you can sign up for next week's program, and we'll see everybody next time. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.